Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is that you're watching this, which is left side of the aisle. And I'm your host. Larry Erickson is my name. And for the next nearly half hour, I'm going to be going on about a couple of things that I think are important, or at least interesting, and are certainly worthy of your attention. I will say, if you have any reactions to the show, you can email them to me directly. My personal email is whoviating, WHOVIATING at AOL.com. If you didn't catch that, go to my website. It's called Lotus Surviving a Dark Time, and the URL will be here a couple times during the show. And you can get the email address from there if you'd like, or you can leave a comment at the website if you'd rather. Just if you do send me email, two things as always. One, include something in the subject line that makes it clear this is not spam, it's about the show. And two, be a little patient about getting an answer, because I just am lousy at answering email. So with that, let's get to it. And the first thing I'm going to talk about, this is something I've been meaning to talk about for weeks. Several weeks I've been meaning to do this, but always it got pushed aside. There was something that seemed more immediate or more, I don't know, ran out of time, all kinds of reasons. But so I decided this week I'm going to do it first. I'm just going to do this to make sure it gets done. So, many people, in fact, I think most people in this country who are aware of the debate, would say that the most important Supreme Court decision on the right of a woman to terminate her pregnancy, that is, to get an abortion, was the 1973 case called Roe v. Wade. Those people are wrong. Right now, the most important controlling decision is Planned Parenthood v. Casey. This is a 1992 Supreme Court decision that said that states can regulate access to abortion so long as those restrictions do not place an, I quote, undue burden on the woman. That phrase in the years since has proved to be a loophole big enough for a whole battalion of anti-choice fanatics to march through in their never-ending quest to return to the days when women were to be kept barefoot and pregnant. The cold fact here is that the right to an abortion, while it is still supposedly the law of the land, as it has been for over 40 years, that right is under an unrelenting and increasingly successful attack that has been founded by and that the anti-choicers have successfully rebranded themselves from opponents of abortion to protectors of the health and safety of women. The result has been a spate of what are known as trap laws, targeted regulation of abortion provider. These are laws that put extreme and medically unnecessary conditions and requirements on abortion centers, which usually operate as freestanding clinics, but which under these laws are required to have the facilities of ambulatory surgical centers and be staffed by physicians with admitting privileges in a hospital no more than 30 miles away, even if the only abortions they perform are done with medication and they perform no surgeries at all. Now, who says these requirements are medically unnecessary? Well, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists and the American Medical Association, to name two. The thing is, the states that pass these laws don't care. What they care about is that most clinics can't meet the added expense of these unnecessary additions and expansions of their facilities, and that a significant number of hospitals, many of which are associated with some Catholic organization, refuse to give admitting privileges to doctors that perform abortions, and a lot of other hospitals won't give you admitting privileges if you don't admit at least a certain minimum number of patients per year. The result of these laws is that then the clinics have to close. Bloomberg.com actually did a story about this recently, and I'm quoting their story. Abortion access in the United States has been vanishing at the fastest annual pace on record. Still quoting. Since 2011, at least 162 abortion providers have shut or stopped offering the service, while just 21 opened. At no time since before 1973 has a woman's ability to terminate a pregnancy been more dependent on her zip code or financial resources for travel. The drop-off in providers, more than one every 2 weeks, occurred in 35 states, in both small towns and big cities that are home to more than 30 million women of reproductive age, unquote. The thing is, there were never that many clinics to begin with. Back in 2011, before this additional sharp drop-off, the Guttmacher Institute counted only about 1,700 nationwide. What's more, the clinic closures tend to be concentrated in red states, where reactionary state legislatures have been able to push through the harshest laws, which means that there are places in this country where women simply cannot get an abortion because it's just not available. The defenders of these laws claim that they are necessary to protect the health and safety of the women seeking abortions, but that is a complete and total lie. It's based on the complete and total lie that abortion is a risky procedure with a significant risk of complications that would require hospitalization. In point of fact, abortion is almost remarkably safe. For first trimester abortions, which is when the vast majority of the procedures occur, the rate of complications that could require going to a hospital is 0.05%, or something less than 1 in 2,000. The risk of dying from a legal surgical abortion is minuscule, estimated at about 0.0006%, a bit over 1 in 200,000. A woman is 14 times more likely to die in childbirth than she is from getting an abortion. Which means, of course, that if these people were really concerned about the health and safety of women, they'd urge every pregnant woman to get an abortion in order to better protect her own life. Abortions actually have lower mortality rates than dozens of surgical procedures generally considered safe, including gallbladder removal, knee reconstruction, knee replacement, bariatric surgery, hernia surgery. To hell, the mortality rate for a colonoscopy is 40 times that of surgical abortion. But as Jean Connery, she's the former president of the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, recently said, gastroenterologists who perform colonoscopies outside of a hospital do not have to face similar requirements in the name of safety. It's not about the health and safety of women. It's all lies. And the lies don't stop there. 31 states require women to be given state-written, state-approved informational packets before getting an abortion. Researchers at Rutgers University in New Jersey looked at the information provided in 23 of those states and found that a third of them contained medically inaccurate information, including overstating the degree of development of the fetus. What's more, during the 2015-2016 legislative session, there were some 251 bills in some way restricting access to abortion introduced across 37 states. According to a study by the National Partnership for Women and Families, 70% of those bills were based on lies about either abortion procedures and doctors or about false claims about why a woman would get an abortion, or both. None of this has a damn thing to do with the health and safety of women. In fact, these laws undermine women's health. A 2013 paper in the journal Contraception found a correlation between a lack of clinics, that is, a lack of access to abortion, and a rise at attempts at self-induced abortions, which can be and usually are far riskier than legal ones. The connection between clinic closures and do-it-yourself abortions was even clear in some research done recently by New York Times contributing op-ed writer Seth Stephens-Davidowitz. He looked at Google searches in 2015 that used some term related to self-induced abortions and then compared the state-by-state results for those searches with the harshness of abortion restrictions in each state. The two maps overlapped almost exactly. The more restrictions on access to legal abortion, the greater the interest in self-induced ones. All of which serves to bring us to March 2nd. That was the day the Supreme Court heard oral arguments in the case Whole Women's Health versus Hellerstadt, in which some abortion providers in Texas are challenging that state's extreme anti-choice law. This is, without doubt, the most important case on reproductive rights that the Supreme Court has heard in over 2 decades, ever since the Casey decision. The challenges here won at the district court level, but they lost at the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals level. Now, the Supreme Court stayed that ruling pending its own decision on the case. And here we are. At oral arguments on this law, the court, to I expect no one's surprise, seemed divided. Ginsburg, Kagan, Sotomayor, and Breyer all went after Texas Solicitor General Scott Kelly's rather internally contradictory attempts to defend the law. At one point, for example, Ginsburg asked him how many women in Texas lived over 100 miles from a clinic. And he wound up saying in his response that it's not a problem because women in El Paso, he said, can just go over the border into New Mexico and go to a clinic there. When it was pointed out that New Mexico doesn't have the restrictions and the requirements that Texas is demanding be on clinics, and he was asked why, if those New Mexico standards were good enough for women in El Paso, they weren't good enough for women in the rest of Texas, he never actually answered the question. Alito and Roberts, because Thomas was his usual clam self, they questioned whether or not it could be proved that the closures of the clinics right after the law went into effect were actually because of the law, or was it because it was just a coincidence because of something else entirely? Maybe, I don't know, a fear of an alien invasion or something, I don't know. It seems actually more likely that they were looking for a way, any way they could find, to give Anthony Kennedy a reason to join with them. See, Senator Kennedy, as is always true, is the question mark on abortion. He's made it clear he doesn't like it, but that he's, so far, has never been willing to just shut it down, to just make it unlawful. During oral arguments, he suggested at one point that the law would increase the number of surgical abortions as opposed to those done via medication, which he said, quote, may not be medically wise. He also raised the idea of remanding the case back to lower courts to develop a fuller record about some arcane procedural issue that could push the whole thing back a couple of years down the road. It's possible that by their questioning, Alito and Roberts were suggesting to Kennedy, yes, that's a good idea, let's let the case be sent back. So there are 4 possibilities here. There are clearly 4 votes to strike down the law, 3 to say, screw the women, full right wing ahead, and Anthony Kennedy. It could end up 5-3 to protect existing women's rights. It could be a 4-4 tie, which would leave the lower court ruling intact. That ruling would be that of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which upheld the Texas law. The result would be then that the Texas law stands, but the case would establish no precedent for the rest of the country. That, however, would still be a significant blow for reproductive rights because it would tell other state legislatures that until there's a change on the Supreme Court, if you have a conservative level appeals court, such as, for example, not only the 5th, but the 4th and the 6th are as well, you can pass these trap laws and the Supreme Court will not turn them down, which ultimately would likely increase the number of such restrictions that women face. A third possibility would be for the court to throw up its hands and call for re-argument next term, with the idea that maybe by then there'll be a 9th justice so you could avoid a deadlock. Finally would be the stall, the punt, sending it back to the lower courts with all the delays and dragging out that would entail. A decision is not expected before June, but if you want to engage in some speculation, there may be a hint of how the court is leaning to be found in another closely related case. See, Louisiana has an anti-choice law essentially identical to the Texas one, which is now before the Supreme Court. In January, U.S. District Court Judge John DeGravelis ruled that the law violates the constitutional right of Louisiana women to obtain an abortion. In February, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, the same circuit court that upheld the Texas law, overruled Judge DeGravelis and allowed the law to go into effect. The expected result would be to close all but one single clinic in the entire state of Louisiana. This was despite the fact that the Supreme Court had already stayed the Fifth Circuit Court's ruling in the Texas case. However, the Fifth Circuit said here that because under that order, that is the one about the Texas law, that order had been issued without stating the High Court's reasoning, which, by the way, these orders usually don't contain any reasoning, but never mind. The Fifth Circuit said that because it contained no reasoning, they had no guidance. And so the Fifth Circuit was free to make its own judgment and allow the Louisiana law to go into effect. About a week later, 2 days after oral arguments on the Texas case, the Supreme Court granted an emergency stay of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals order in the Louisiana case. Now, what's significant here is that the order vacating the Fifth Circuit Court's order about Louisiana began by saying, consistent with the court's action granting a stay in the Texas case. Now, that phrase may not seem like much, but this is a definite legal smackdown after the Fifth Circuit pretended to not know what the Supreme Court wanted. Now, considering that if it was certain that the justices were in a 4-4 deadlock, and so the Texas law would stand, with the natural follow that the identical Louisiana law would also stand, there would seem to be both less cause for the smackdown and less cause for the emergency stay. So it could be taken as a hopeful sign that the majority of the court does not accept the premises of these laws and will in fact strike them down, and some people have interpreted it precisely that way. Unfortunately, it could also mean nothing but that the courts are irritated with the Fifth Circuit's freewheeling on this issue and not paying attention to the High Court's obvious preference to leave things in place, that is, as they were before the law started, until the Supreme Court issues its own ruling. So in that particular question, we'll just have to wait and see. What we can't afford to wait and see is the broader war over reproductive rights and the actual health of women, and the ongoing and disturbingly successful attempts by the fanatics to undo not only the 21st, but also the entire 20th century. That fight goes on every day, and at this moment, we're taking a break. And here we are back again. Next up, on something that is actually related, it really is related to what I was just talking about, something that points out the need for continuing fights for justice. According to this year's World Economic Forum Global Gender Gap Report, the United States ranks 28th among nations of the world in terms of the equality of men and women. That is 8 slots lower than last year. The report looks at data from 145 countries, put the United States 74th in terms of equal pay for equal work, 81st in terms of the number of women in high government positions. On the other hand, the U.S. did rank pretty high in terms of education and life expectancy. Kim Parker, Director of Social Trends Research at the Pew Research Center, was not surprised by the results. She said, and I'm quoting, "We have not been at the leading edge internationally of female representation in top leadership positions, nor in gender pay equity." The fact is, we have to keep on keeping on because there is still a great deal to do. By the way, there's a footnote to that footnote. Something I just found something interesting. Now, first, that World Economic Forum report I just mentioned, it found that the most equal country in the world for men and women is Iceland, which has occupied the top spot for 7 years in a row now. Norway, Finland, Sweden, and Ireland finished out the top 5. Okay. Another study I came across, this really was by coincidence, I happened to come across this study. This is a study of the world's most literate nations, which the study ranked nations, the author said, quote, not by their populace's ability to read, but rather their populace's literate behaviors and their supporting resources. In other words, just as it wasn't how you could read, it also, they considered things like libraries, availability of libraries, public support, newspapers, compulsory schooling, educational availability, also things again like reading assessments, computer availability, a whole range of things related to not just being able to read a simple sentence, but being able to engage in literate behavior in the society around you. Okay, based on those criteria, the 5 nations that top the list of the world's most literate nations were, in order, Finland, Norway, Iceland, Denmark, and Sweden. And I'm wondering if anyone else sees a pattern emerging here. Those damn socialist democracies, I gotta tell you. All right, something else I have to talk about, have to bring up. Last week, I said of our bombing and drone wars, I said of them that as effective responses to terrorism, they haven't worked, they're not working, and they won't work. This week brings the news that Al-Shabaab, this is the extremist Muslim militants in Somalia, which is one of the targets of our lovely little war, has regrouped under a new leader, one Ahmed Umar, and is showing signs of a resurgence despite the billions of dollars that have been and are being spent by the United States to fight them. They become a lethal insurgency sufficiently strong that Daesh is now trying to convince them to switch their allegiance to them instead of their current allegiance to Al-Qaeda. What we're doing is not working. We have to take another way. And here's something that might be taken as a sort of example, at least in a general way, of what might be another road or another way. Now, you may recall that I was actually ambivalent about the Iran deal. The one that involved lifting economic sanctions on Iran in exchange for restrictions on its nuclear program. And I was ambivalent because it seemed like to me like imperialism, like a group of big nations bullying a small one to doing what they wanted, and doing it over a nuclear weapons program that I was never convinced actually existed. But I ultimately approved of the deal. I ultimately supported the deal because I thought a failure of that deal would be even worse, that it would lead to increased calls for and quite possibly the happening of a military attack against Iran. Well, sometimes good things come out of bad. It can fairly be argued that it was that agreement and the associated lifting of sanctions that came with it that provided the political opening for the dramatic victory of reformist and moderate conservative parties in the elections for the Iranian parliament that took place a couple of weeks ago. Reformist parties won 85 seats in the 290-seat body. Moderate conservatives won 73 more. Meanwhile, hardliner parties lost 44 seats, dropping them down to 68. Together, the reformist and moderate conservative parties have an absolute majority in Parliament and are expected to work together at least on economic issues. Overall, President Hassan Rouhani will face a friendlier Parliament as he tries to push through measures for some increased social freedoms and reform in the economy. This result is also likely to lead to greater economic and political openings and improved contacts with the West. And some of those among elected, particularly among the women, are prepared to fight and argue for greater social freedoms within Iran. The changes are unlikely to be dramatic. The hardliner old guard, particularly in the person of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, still has a strong grip on power. Indeed, some say these changes will not come at all, claiming that many of those who ran as reformers or moderates are actually hardliners, and that the Guardian Council, which vets election candidates, screened out all the real reformers. But even that, which is disheartening to the extent that it's true, gives some cause for hope. The very fact that these people had to label themselves reformers in order to get elected points to the shifting nature of the Iranian electorate, a shift also revealed in the fact that 60% of the population of Iran is under 30 years old, and those people show much greater interest in, let's call it, a less rigorous lifestyle and less rigorous politics than their elders do. So even though I thought the whole confrontation with Iran need never have happened, the fact remains, you ditch the threats, you ditch the warmongering, you reach an agreement acceptable to both sides, and this happens. Some will insist it's a coincidence, some insist the agreement had absolutely nothing to do with it, but frankly, I don't buy it. All right, last up for this week, we have the Clown Award, and again, I had multiple possibilities. First off, you think same-sex couples have the right to get married? Well, yes, they do. But do they have the right to get matrimonied? Kentucky State Representative Joseph Fisher has introduced a bill called the Matrimonial Freedom Act that creates the new status of matrimony, which is separate from marriage because while any two adults can marry, only if they're opposite-sex couples can they get matrimonied. The bill then proceeds for 450 pages, meticulously adding language about matrimony to any provision in state law that defines the basic parameters of marriage, and then in any provision that describes a privilege or benefit of marriage, the word marriage is replaced by the word matrimony, effectively stripping same-sex couples of any and all benefits of marriage. The reason this is so laughable is, for one, that there's no way that this would fly in the courts, this attempt to do an end run around the Supreme Court. There's no way it would ever fly. But I picture Fisher sitting alone in his office late at night, going through the entire legal code line by line, a bottle of scotch on the desk, a single high-intensity lamp lighting his weary work. Now, of course, he did the whole thing by computer search, I'm sure, but that image just seems more fitting to the undertaking, especially since the bill declares that the Supreme Court has established an absolute tyranny over these states and includes the line, "With a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor," which, in case you don't recognize it, is the last line of the Declaration of Independence. But believe it or not, he got outclassed. So this week, the big red nose goes to federal immigration judge Jack Weil. The ACLU and immigration rights groups have filed a class action suit against the federal government, demanding that the government provide appointed counsel for every indigent child who cannot afford a lawyer in immigration court proceedings. They contend that by failing to provide counsel, the Justice Department had violated due process and the children's right to a fair trial under the Immigration and Nationality Act. The Justice Department is contesting the suit, and Judge Weil, this week's bozo, is one of the government's chief witnesses. So what did he do? In a deposition taken in October, but just recently released, he declared that providing counsel in such cases is unnecessary because you can do a fair hearing, he said, even with toddlers representing themselves in court, claiming he has taught immigration law to 3- and 4-year-olds. And it occurs to me I actually don't even really have to go on, do I? Immigration Judge Jack Weil, my gosh, what a clown. All right, that's it for this week. We're going to get out of here. We'll be back. You just have, in the meantime, the best week you possibly can. We look forward to seeing you back here next week. And for now, as always, peace.